Welcome to the last session of the first day. You probably don't have a lot of neurotransmitters left from the other sessions, so we'll have some fun in this one, but I think there'll be some interesting advice in it. I've been around this business a long time. It's probably fairly obvious. I learned to write code for the first time in 1973 as a freshman in college. Fortran was my first language. I was talking to people about code editors here. Somebody said Eclipse, and what? Do you have any old code? Any of you used old code editors? Like VI? Yeah, VI is pretty typical. You want to guess what my first code editor was? Punched cards on a machine. Now, by 1978, I had moved up to mini computers. One of the early systems I worked on helped me understand that this industry has some traditions about lying in it. And as a joke, my roommate named our first system the Lumber Information and Retrieval System, abbreviated LIARS. But it was for salespeople to sell lumber. And so salespeople in this industry often lie, and they don't even know it, do they? They don't even realize it. Now, the question then is, do developers lie to themselves? The way salesmen sometimes do. Well, surely not anybody in this crowd. You're the best developers around, right? That's why you're at the conference. That's why somebody paid for you to come, because you are, as we say in English, the cream of the crop. None of you would ever lie to yourself, would you? Well, maybe occasionally. So we'll go through some of the things I've seen in my 50 years that I consider to be areas that developers do tend to deceive themselves somewhat. One is in the area of software estimation. Developers as a group tend to be rather optimistic. And so I've seen this many, many times. People telling themselves, yeah, I can get that done in a week or 2 weeks or something, when in fact that's a completely unrealistic expectation. And it's not that people do this when they're young and getting started that bothers me. What bothers me about it is, even after they've had several times where they did this and it took 3 months or whatever, they still come back the next time and with these overly optimistic estimates. Any guilty parties of that kind of estimation here? Yeah, oh man, you're an honest crowd. Thank you. That's like half the people in here. That's good. Now, the thing is, you're going to be asked how long something will take, and you do need to have an answer, because other people in your business need to know how long that a project is going to take. And unfortunately, even though some developers don't like it, estimation is just a part of what we do because of the investment nature of software. Estimates don't have to be overly precise, but good enough so that you know whether it makes sense to go forward with a project or not. There's a difference between spending $50,000 or euros on something and 500,000 or 5 million. So at some level, we need to estimate. In our experience, we strive that 90% of our projects, we can tell you what they will take within about 20%. And we manage to hit that pretty good. Every once in a while, we get something wrong because there are things sometimes beyond our control that skew the estimate. And of course, the most common thing that I think most developers would claim is, well, they changed the requirements on us. Well, the problem there is you didn't find out enough up front to do a good estimate. That you share the blame, by the way, when that happens. So don't lie to yourself and think that, well, they told us everything, we'll just estimate based on that. Keep probing until you have an understanding that, okay, I understand this project well enough that based on my experience, I can tell you something about how long it's going to take. But some developers really never manage to master estimation, to the extent that there are some agile methodologies that claim we don't need to estimate at all. Just tell us what to do and we'll keep doing it till we're done. And I find that problematic. I tend to work with executives and decision makers and people who sign checks, and they really don't like that. And if you do that, if you say, well, we're just not going to do estimates, then you get a different problem, which is you get the arbitrary deadline. You don't estimate, so somebody does it for you. Do you think they're better at estimation than you are? Probably not. How many of you have been the subject of an arbitrary deadline imposed on you at some point? That's 90+%. Okay. What's going on with that? Why does that happen? Well, it's so common. As I said, it's a cost-benefit thing. You can't calculate cost-benefit if you don't know the cost. So the people who sign checks and the people that make decisions need something in their head for how long will this take, how much money will it take. And if you don't tell them, they will sort of come up with something. And it's so common, as you saw in this room, that I have an interview question about that. When I interview developers, there's a standard question that I ask. I call it the Kobayashi Maru interview question. Basically, what I do is explain to them something like the following. Suppose that you are presented with a project and you have listened to everything that they've told you about it, and in your head, based on your experience, you think it will take 6 months or 8 months. And then the sponsor or the manager says, and we've promised it to the customer in 2 months. And you know it can't be done in that period. Then what do you do? As Kirk says, there is no right answer. This is a test of character. And what a lot of people tend to do at that point is to go, well, they switch to a different way of lying to themselves. If I just work 12 hours a day, I could meet this impossible deadline. Well, no. I mean, if it really is impossible, if you know that it is, then by definition, this is a lie. Now, it's always possible that maybe it turns out better than you thought and such. So it isn't just always, I guess, but 99% of the time. Now, this just calms the manager down for a little while until the impossible deadline is missed, because that's pretty much inevitably what happens. And since all of you have been there, you've been through that too. Right? You've gone through the missed deadlines, and everybody knows that they're a problem, and yet somehow we don't seem to get rid of them. They don't go away. Why not? Well, there are several things that drive impossible deadlines. As I said, we've got to have some decent estimates, and if we don't do it ourselves, they're going to do it for us. And if they do it for us, here are their problems. First of all, industry hype. People who sell things to build software have no interest in you really knowing for sure how long something will take. Their objective is to sell you something. Their objective is not necessarily to be honest with you about what it will take to use it. And then misunderstanding of how software is even developed. We have a lot of managers that don't really understand what you do. Software development has changed so much in the last 20 years or 25 years. Many of them have never worked on the tools and platforms that you work on. They don't understand continuous integration. They don't understand modern platforms and the cloud. So they don't really understand how you do it. And then mediocre managers, that they don't know what else to do. They try to get more work out of you by just telling you, you have to get it done by now, by this time. That's just a reflex on their part. The industry hype thing has been around for quite a while now, and I get asked about it sometimes. That I drew this for the first time, back about 2012, when a manager was asking me. He said, I go to those Microsoft keynotes, and they build something in 15 minutes, a whole solution. And then I go take it back to my team and say, well, we need to do something like this. And they go, yeah, well, 6 months. And I explained to him that when you do demos, you will make the demo come out in 15 minutes because that's as much time span, attention span as you have in the typical audience. If you're doing something complex and technical, you got about 15 minutes before their attention will wander. So you must fit your demo into 15 minutes. And the fact that things are 10 times as complex today as they were 25 years ago doesn't change that. So, it always looks easy in the demos, but it gets harder to do with every year. So that drives some impossible deadlines, especially among the managers who think it's pretty much as easy as it used to be, and it obviously isn't. But as I said, they don't really understand software development anyway. You might as well be back there in your office or cubicle stirring a cauldron and saying magic spells for all they know. They really don't have a very complete mental model in many cases of how software is developed. It's so limited that it's almost a magical thing to them. So they impose an arbitrary deadline because they don't know what else to do. They just hope you'll pull out some better magic spells. Don't give in to arbitrary deadlines. That's one of my first pieces of professional advice today. That's what that question about the Kobayashi Maru is intended to convey. I want to see if somebody gives in to arbitrary deadlines. If your answer to that question is, well, I'll just work harder, or it's, well, I know I can't get it done, but I'll go and do the best I can, and then we'll wait for the deadline to pass. No, we need more clarity and honesty in this industry, so don't give in to them. That doesn't mean, well, let's put it this way. Let me tell you about a situation I was in with arbitrary deadlines and what I did about it. Sometimes you have to get creative. This was 1995, 6, and we had been working on a system for, at that time, about 3 months, and our estimate was 6 or 7. We started in February, and we were pretty sure we could get it done by the end of June. This was a product for this company. July, maybe. We a little bit of wiggle room there. A new president came in, and he's meeting with all the software development teams. And here's what he said to me. I was leading one of the teams, and he said, "This product is very important." He says that to everybody. This product is very important, and I've talked to customers, and they need for it to be done by the beginning of May. And I said, I can't do it. There's just too much to do. We can't get it done by then. Well, I'm sure if you think about it, you'll find some ways to do it. So that's that meeting. And then we come back the next week, and we got the same meeting, and it's the same result. But I don't ever tell him in these meetings, yes, we can do it. Finally, about the 4th time that he puts his pressure on us, I created a memo that said what it will take for us to meet this deadline. And option 1 was some new computers for testing, or some new. 2 was some new tools. I don't even remember, it was so long ago. But item 3 was a time machine to bring the finished product back from the future when we get it done. Cost $1 trillion. I pointed out you could reuse the time machine for other projects too. So don't give in to arbitrary deadlines. Find a way to convey the message that they are impossible, that you just can't do it. Surprisingly enough, they will appreciate that in the end. Maybe not when you first confront them with it, but they will eventually. Now let's switch to a different category of lies that developers tell themselves. There's one main one and then several sort of subsidiary lies. And it starts with the idea that my main job is to write code. No, it is not. Your main job is to produce functional, stable software that fits the needs of the business. Ideally, that would be in as little code as you can get away with. Now, writing code is certainly a part of that, but that's not your job, and that is not the goal. But here's the thing is, we started back in the late 90s with Java and then later .NET. We made everything so complex that only people who are very comfortable with code and APIs have survived to this point. there are probably only a sprinkling of you in this room who don't like to write code. I don't. Code is the chore to finish something up after I've already figured it out in my head. But I know, see, I went all the way back to punch cards. You had to do that in that era. Now you don't, and so most people do not. We have selected and filtered the developer community down to people who love to write code, or at least really, really like it. And that's fine. I mean, it is a big part of your job, but it leads people into a psychological mindset, because if you love it, that's what you want to be doing, and that means that you can neglect things that add to the value of the software systems you produce. You can blow off, as we say in English, architecture and UX design and testing, talking to users, etc. It's easy to rationalize not doing that when you really want to be back there writing code. And in fact, the problem is so serious. I've been talking about this for about 15 years. I did a little video on it back then about the fact that in this industry, a significant fraction of developers have a substance abuse problem. You know what that English phrase means? You have an addiction. And the substance you're addicted to is code. Right, here's my expression of what I'm trying to get across. And see, it's like code heads, coke heads. That's just one line, that's one letter different. And both groups do lines to get their fix. It's just fits too well, doesn't it? Now the thing about that is, I can actually tell you, I can give you a diagnostic that tells you whether or not you are a code addict. You want to hear the diagnostic? Okay. You've been in those meetings where they tell you, where they introduce this module or feature that you're going to build. And perhaps it is scheduled for 90 minutes to explain all of the ramifications. But 10 minutes into the meeting, you're not really listening to the person presenting anymore because you're already coding the solution in your head. Okay, do we have anyone who will admit to that problem? That's the sign of an addiction. That's worse than smoking. I mean, you can put smoking aside for 90 minutes. Usually most smokers can do that. But you can't put code aside for 10 minutes. That's the sign of an addiction. Oh, well, there's another one too. If you've ever kind of been in the flow just producing this code and you've got 100 lines of terrific code and you sort of pull back and look at it and you get this little like shiver. Man, that's some good code. So you need to be aware of your addiction, because your addiction will lead you into doing things that you shouldn't. Because perfect code doesn't solve the problem, has no value. So concentrate on other things to make sure you're writing the right code. You're writing valuable code. You're writing useful code. Related to that is people who don't think that they have any capabilities whatsoever in crafting a good user interface. They don't want to do it. They want to be writing code instead. And they say, well, the excuse is, I'm a coder, I can't do that anyway. I have been training developers to do UI and UX design for 15 years. My success rate runs in the 80 to 90% range. Most developers can learn some of the essentials. I'm not talking about turning developers into designers, but goodness, the stuff we produce today is horrible for the most part, especially in business applications. We can do a lot better than that. I can help developers understand how to avoid some of the common mistakes and maybe even innovate a little bit to add considerably more value to the software you produce. So it is possible. I will say, though, that there is a type of person who can't do it. And I'll tell you about that in just a minute. Let's see, yeah. So why don't you do it? Well, one of the issues is that you have this mental model, many of you, in your head, that you can't do design because you have to be some special person to do design. You have to have some special creative spark. I call that the flamingo fallacy. You think designers are like the colorful creatures, the flamingos, very different from you developer types who are more like turkey vultures, looking on in envy. That's a false mental model. As I said, you don't have to turn yourself into a designer, but you can learn some fundamentals. And the nice thing about learning some of those fundamentals is once you learn them, they stick with you for the whole career. You go out and learn some, I don't know, Angular today. How long will you be using Angular? 5 years if you're lucky? 10 at the most? That world will turn over. It will change. But design concepts are based in the human brain, and they don't change. So a little bit of learning goes a long way there. Now, one of the related things is that developers have this false notion, and you're not the only ones. Lots of people in this industry do, including managers. They think that design is about making the app pretty. That encompasses pretty much all that it is. So I don't have to worry about it. My spouse won't let me pick out paint at Home Depot. Well, you don't have Home Depot here. What do you have? Where do you go buy paint? I'm sorry? Here, yeah. Aki? Yeah. So you're not allowed to pick out paint at Aki. That's the concept among the developer community. Well, that's again a lie because you don't have to worry about this. Design is not about making the app pretty because good aesthetics can't fix a bad app. You can put makeup on a pig and it doesn't matter. Aesthetics only take you so far. And the most obvious example of this mistake being made was 10 years ago when Microsoft introduced this piece of junk. They thought, we make it pretty and sparkly, it'll be a big success. Look at me, I'm so hip. You guys, some of you watch Rick and Morty, I'm sure, so you know who Mr. Meeseeks is. So I would encourage you to at least have some members on your team who have some sensibilities about getting the user interface right. Or if you do have interaction designers, not just visual designers are great. Nobody wants an ugly app. Nobody wants an ugly website. I'm glad that they can pick out colors and get some decent layout. But you start to get involved with understanding the interaction because you know more about the domain, you know more about how the business works than those visual designers ever will. So you have a role to play, and don't blow it off. Another one in the want to write code space is that I find there's a regrettable tendency of developers to look at any rules that are presented to them. Someone comes to them and says, this is the way the business needs to work. And the first thing they think is, I need to write some code for that. Well, sometimes you do. But there's some severe limitations if you put lots and lots of business rules in code. Let's talk about data validation as an example. Because I work in healthcare where the rules vary a lot based on who you're talking to right now, I've been doing dynamic data validation for a long time. And it's quite possible to get rules for data validation external to the code and then have an engine that knows how to run those rules. That's quite practical. Even down to having scripted rules. It's quite practical. It does take some interesting architecture and some thought. If you jump straight into writing code, you will never get there. But the objective is you'd love to have rules in metadata or somewhere in a database so that the validation engine can interpret those for you. I mean, see, if you don't do that, if you put the rules in code, and it's okay for some rules to go into code. It's fine. Static rules that don't tend to change, rarely or not at all, it's okay for those rules to be in code. But business object frameworks, many of them put all the rules in code, and that's what's bad. Because you take, say, the data validation example. If those rules are constantly changing, and they're in code, who has to maintain those rules? Well, you do. Is that fun maintenance to do? No, nobody wants to do that. Think about the advantages of getting that off of your responsibility area and giving it to a domain expert. And if the rules are external, then that turns out to be quite practical, much, much more practical. So, good reasons to to not consider all rules in code. And another area besides data validation that's important is workflow. It's a very funny, strange thing that I run into. I go into clients, several new ones a year, and one of the standard questions I talk about in understanding their systems is, do you have workflow? And 80% of the time, they say no. And 90% of them, when I analyze their system, it has workflow in it. They just don't call it that. If you've got something that's handling work and tracking it over time, if you've got something that keeps up with where people are in some process or flow, then you have workflow. But what I usually find is it's just kludged. It's completely kludged up because somebody jumped into writing code when they had this little workflow explained. And so they wrote some code to do that. And they may have a database table somewhere to track the states of the workflow. And then somebody else came along with a different workflow, and they wrote their own version in code. That's pretty common. How many of you think you probably have some systems somewhere in your applications that are like what I just described? Okay, that's about a quarter of you. I bet the percentage is higher than that if you really started looking at it. So here's the thing about workflow to think about. If you're a developer, you should think about it like this. Because look, this is a big challenge, actually, to get right. But it's a very high-value challenge. Do you realize how much productivity increases with well-constructed workflow in an application? Guiding users through what they need to do has enormous payback. But developers don't tend to think in terms of workflow. They think in terms of code. And some of the worst developers in the world about that work in Redmond, Washington. Microsoft doesn't understand workflow at all. They tried with BizTalk. That was their first major workflow product, and they failed with that. And then they had Windows Workflow 1, which was so abysmally bad, they immediately replaced it with Windows Workflow 2, which wasn't really very much better. And they're currently in the process of screwing it up in the cloud with Logic apps. Because all of those are code-centric ways of looking at workflow. And that's not what workflow is. Workflow needs an architecture that determines what work items are. What are the things people work on? And queues of those items, analogous to stacks of paper that would represent the items. Work items, queues, and some place to put the rules to process the items and get them to the next queue. Now, this kind of architecture is fairly advanced architecture, I will certainly admit. This is a cut-down version of one that I architected and developed about 16, 17 years ago for handling the entire process from ordering to shipping of prescription drugs. This was for this company did it for prisons, by the way. Our internal code name for that app was Drugs for Thugs. So what would happen is that the doctors would fax in. When we came in, it was 5,000 pages of fax a day. And then now that has to go through the entire workflow. And people were taking paper around and getting it all done. And so I designed and wrote, with my partner's help, this architecture and general framework for doing workflow so that you could have as many queues as you wanted and you could define new queues in the database. Pretty much on the fly, as long as you went and put in a little bit of code for rules to tell how to route the items around. This was pretty successful. It cut the development time significantly because creating a new queue is a matter of minutes. And we turned out to need a lot of them. We thought we needed about 20. We ended up with 43 queues in the finished system. But the result was that labor cost for that entire workflow to get from end to end was cut by 50%. They had 200 people. At the end of that, they only needed 100. They didn't fire anybody. They just didn't replace anybody that quit for about 2 years. So workflow is extremely valuable, and you might get up to something like that. But even minimal workflow, we had one company that they made commercial software for management of propane delivery, and we did some very simple workflow for people that worked in propane shops. The common things that they needed to do. What is that show with propane and propane accessories? King of the Hill, yeah. Think of that guy as the user of this system. And minimal workflow for them was one of the things that sold their package. So from simple all the way up to extremely complex, workflow is a place where you can add a lot of value, and developers tend not to do it because you tend to think of code-centric solutions. This is not a code-centric solution. This requires you to step back, look away from that pretty girl over there, and do architecture and then in framework design. I'm not going to ask you how many of you have the word architect in your job title, but I will tell you this. Having that in your job title does not make you an architect. So don't assume that you are because you got that title. Remember, the people above you don't really understand what you do. We've talked about that. So they don't know how to motivate you. So that leads to some situations where they substitute what they ought to do with what's easy to do. And changing your job title is easy. They don't have to get permission from anybody probably to do that. Where if they want to get you more money, they do. Well, I guess it feels good to get architect in your job title, but I would suggest instead that you do what I did back when I got a brand new boss. And he starts the conversation and says, Billy, I've talked to people and we feel like you do a great job, but you don't get enough recognition. And I knew what was coming. I've been in the business at that time long enough. And I don't think he expected the answer I gave him, which is, well, I prefer recognition that I can deposit in my bank account. That's the way you should think about it. Don't let a job title. And here's the thing about it. I've kind of lost the battle here. Bank of America was the largest bank. I think maybe J.P. Morgan Chase is now in America. But Bank of America, about 5 years ago when I was talking to someone there, had 2,000 people with architect in their job title. Do you think 2,000 people in that company are doing useful architecture? That's impossible. They get in each other's way. It's my opinion that there's kind of an optimum. Depending on the size of the company and the project, a few architects, true architects, can do quite a lot and have a big impact. And the more you add, boy, the results start going downhill. Because here's the thing. If you're putting out a bunch of microservices isn't architecture. If they're extremely granular, which most of them are, I mean, that's the whole idea. Researching APIs to use, that's not architecture. It's useful stuff, and I don't mean to say that it isn't, but there's a difference between that and architecture. If you really want to understand what architecture is all about, this is the resource I recommend for that. You guys heard of Yuval Lowy? I see a couple of head nods. He is considered to be one of the foremost experts on architecture in the world. He has worked mostly in the Microsoft space, and I've known him for about 25 years. He and I are good friends. So I would recommend that this book's about 2 years old, and I'd recommend you take a look at that. He was originally Austrian, by the way, and which means that his English sounds kind of Austrian in the sense that it will be more familiar to you. That he writes like a European. So you may like that, even though it's in English. Because remember, you've got those things you need to worry about and not just spend all your time writing code. Now I'm going to tell you another lie that I find that developers tell themselves. And they don't know that they're lying because so many of them do it. And I understand why they don't realize it. But I have to expose this lie and try to convince you that it is a lie. I hear far too many people in this industry, when they talk about creating software, they say, well, I have to build something to show to the users because the users can't tell me what to write, what to do, what the software needs to do. Some of you may hold that false idea in your head. Now, there are some edge cases where it's true, but the vast, vast majority of the time, you can work with users to find out what needs to be done. It is true that users can't design software or user interfaces. That is not their job. But they do understand how their job works by definition. If they're competent at it, they understand their job. What you need to do is get that out of them. And I am indebted to a man named Alan Cooper. You know who he was? Who he is? Well, he still is. He's retired now. You don't even know who he is, do you? And you use his stuff, most of you, every day. He's the inventor of the drag and drop development environment. He created a product that became Visual Basic 1. And then founded a company to do interaction design, wrote the main book, the kind of foundational work on interaction design back in the 90s. He has another book too. It's about you guys, you ladies, you folks. The inmates are running the asylum. And I'm indebted to him because I saw him on stage on Microsoft campus 15 so years ago. They had an event, the Microsoft Patterns and Practices group. He's doing the keynote. I'm going to present on the same stage after he's done. So I'm there early listening to him because he's very well known and very smart. And he said, if somebody says, the users can't tell me, that's a cop-out. It's a skill that you need to know how to do to draw that out of them. Just because you've never done it and think you can't do it, you must not jump to the conclusion that nobody can do it or that you can't learn to do it. It's a skill. Now, remember, you don't want to do it. The distracted girlfriend will tell you that. The distracted boyfriend will tell you that. But I will tell you that it can be done because I've done it for my entire career. And that's why I was so surprised when people started telling me this. Users can't design for you, but they understand their jobs, and you can learn to talk to them and get out of them what you need. Not every single detail, but enough so that you can create a foundation that can then be refined with minor changes to suit them ideally. And what I find is that the first foundational skill to do this is to get better at listening. And I would say developers aren't very good at listening, but that's really not the way to say it. Human beings aren't very good at listening. There's research on this. Do you know what the typical time that someone actively listens to someone talking to them before their mind wanders? Do you know what that typical time is? Guesses? What do you guess? 15 minutes. Now that's what? 2 minutes? He says 2. Anybody else got any ideas? What? You guys aren't anywhere close. See, that's why I say you don't know. 10 seconds before the mind wanders. Now, they may pull the mind back, but active listening, 10 to 15 seconds is typical before an intrusive thought enters their mind. And look, you know this because you've seen it. You've talked to that person. You've talked to somebody, and you're explaining things to them, and at some point, they start to get this sort of look. I mean, I'm exaggerating it a little bit, but you get the idea. You realize that they have stopped listening to you, and they're just pretending to listen. You've all seen that, and I'm telling you, it happens faster and more often than you think, and they don't always show it. Some people are pretty good at faking the look on their face that they're listening when they're not. So, what do you do about that? Well, there's a book by Olivia Fox-Cabane on presence and the art and science of personal magnetism. It turns out that if you listen to people, your reputation with them goes up unconsciously, almost immediately. Listening is a very valuable skill. Listening can save a marriage. Listening can save a career. It's worth working on. And there's a whole chapter in this book. With exercises, for example, you can get, because I've worked on this and with people and seen it, you can get that period of active listening up to about 90 seconds. That's kind of about the best you can do, but before it will wander. But you learn the skills of knowing that the intrusive thought is coming in and bringing your mind back centered on who you're talking to. That gets better with practice. So practice it. You might, the funny thing is you practice that. Don't tell your spouse that you're working on listening, and see if he or she notices. You might be surprised. All right, here's another thing that developers tend to blow off. I didn't put it on my distracted boyfriend thing, but how many of you have to interview members for your team at some point? Yeah, that's 90+% of the people in the room. Why? Like, don't you have an HR department? Why don't they do it? See, you understand. HR doesn't have a clue about what we do. They're worse than the managers. So they obviously can't interview for the team. They might find people for you, but they can't do the interview. But since it's not a primary part of your job, it's very common for developers just to take their pad and, take the copy of the resume or whatever into the conference room and just sit there and chat for a while. Just socialize. See, that's where the problem lies, is that we are members of kind of a different tribe than most people. How many of you does your mom understand what you do for a living? And a lot of you, probably your spouse doesn't either. So when we find someone else in our tribe, our first impulse is to socialize and get to know them because we don't find that many. So that is the way the interview typically goes, is that you begin to socialize. Well, that's fine. I mean, we do want to know that somebody is social and will fit on the team. But you reach the end of 45 minutes or something, and you really don't know that much about what the person can actually do. You only know whether you like them or not. So, instead, you should prepare for interviewing. I did a course on this for LinkedIn. I'll show you the link a little bit later for it. But one of the things that came out of that course was a list of 20-something questions. And I choose from that list when I do interviews of developers. I started creating this list back in the 1990s. And so for each question, the document has, okay, there's a category for it. There's what the question usually sounds like. The goals, what you're trying to find out from that question, which is not always obvious from the question. And then a bad answer and a good answer to the question, examples. So here is an example question. This, it turns out to be the favorite one off the list for most people. What is the weirdest bug you've ever encountered? Now that sounds like a simple question, but think about what it tells you. The more interesting and strange the bug, that tells you something about their experience level and depth, doesn't it? And then I ask them, okay, how did you solve it? Well, now, as they explain how they solved it, you begin to learn something about how they think about software and code and technology. You get a feel for that. Now, I usually preface this by telling them my strangest bug, and that gives them a little time to think of theirs, because sometimes it takes a little while for people they may not have ever thought about that before. My strangest bug happened all the way back in 1995. I was working on a system. It's the same one that we did the time machine joke about, that I did that joke with the manager. And we were just about ready to release. It had been in testing for 3 or 4 weeks. We'd stamped out all the bugs. We were really happy with it. It's a commercial product, so we got end users that are as clueless as typical end users are for commercial products, especially when they get something new. And so the testers came back with a bug that at seemingly random times, the software would throw up a dialogue, a message box, that said, false. Okay. Nobody knew why, and you could press OK, and it seemed to work okay, but people are going to call if they see that. So I landed on my desk, and I went through all the message box calls, and I sort of tell the person I'm interviewing a little about that process, and what I ended up finding was that somebody was trying to explain that they couldn't write a message to the log file. And so they constructed a message that was unable to find file or open file, and then they should have put a plus for concatenation, but what they put was an equal sign. One character mistyped. And then, so it's unable to open file, and then the name of the file that comes from a variable. And so you've got this string equal this string, and they're different. So what is the result of that? False. So that's a weird bug. That's a strange bug, and it was interesting that I remember it. So that's one of the questions, and you can kind of go through the entire list and see. You learn a lot about how people think. You want to have some questions for both soft skills and technology questions. It's about half and half in my list, but you'll have to adapt the technology questions for your own purposes. So you can go look at my list of questions. There's a bit.ly link for that there, and then a link to it there. And then I have an entire course on LinkedIn if you'd like to do it. It's about 90 minutes. If you'd like to see me, we have mock interviews where we actually have some of the LinkedIn employees set in as actors, and we have fake pretend interviews. Okay. Our attachment to technology. We're in the technology industry because we like technology. If we hated technology, we probably wouldn't be here. So that leads to a temptation to put things in our software just because they're cool. And I tell people, especially in my design classes, every time I hear the phrase, wouldn't it be cool if, that is a red flag for me. That maybe we're trying to do something that's not a good idea. Sometimes it is. But don't lie to yourself and think that anything cool that goes in there is a good thing, because that's really not true. Here's an example of a massive project that got it wrong. The United States F-35 fighter jet program, which spent $1 trillion on fighter jets. And they did get fighter jets out, and they eventually fixed some of the worst of the issues, and we're going to have F-35s for a while. But at the beginning, it really didn't satisfy the goals. It did not replace the F-16 the way everybody thought it would out of the gate, and it still hasn't very completely. If you look at the news coverage about fighter jets being sent to the Ukraine and such, it's F-16s for the most part, if they come from America. What happened? Well, they filled up that cockpit with touchscreens. Well, when they were designing all this, 2010, 2012, touchscreens were the big deal. That's right after the iPhone and the iPad. Touchscreens are cool. So why don't we have touchscreens? Well, the reason you don't want touchscreens in fighter jets is because they give no tactile feedback when you change something. Like, let's turn on the missiles. If you don't know whether your missiles are on for sure or not, as a pilot, you're kind of in trouble, aren't you? They discovered that about 20% of the time, if you weren't looking, you weren't sure that the expected switch didn't actually activate. And of course, the pilots can't take their eye off of whatever's going on. And in fact, this problem is now understood in cars, and we're starting to see the pushback against everything being done with touchscreens in cars. and moving critical things back to tactile switches. But I'm sure that there were people sitting around, this is just my vision of it, early in the project going, touchscreens are cool, man. And they're reprogrammable. Look at all the things we could do. We could change versions over. Let's just do everything in touchscreens. So that's developers lying to themselves about something being cool and being appropriate without really thinking it through. And of course, I've already bashed on Windows 10, but Windows 8, but you just really can't bash Windows 8 enough. Because it was the biggest failure, software design failure ever, and they really tried so hard to be cool. And you probably went to school at some time with one of these people that desperately wants to be cool, but just really doesn't have it in them. And the harder they try, kind of the less cool they are. You've known people like that, haven't you? Well, that's Windows 8. It tried so desperately to be cool, but it just couldn't. Those Power Ranger colors, look at that. That's ugly. I have a session where I spend like 20 minutes tearing apart Windows 8. All the stuff they got wrong. The current wouldn't it be cool technology. Can you guess? There you go. So as inevitably people come to you, managers in many cases who've read the articles, and said, okay, yeah, we need to get some AI in our product because it's cool. Well, maybe you have a good place in your product for AI. Maybe you do. But evaluate it. Don't reflexively put it in there. Think about it and decide that you're doing it. Because there are dangers. AI is much more immature than the hype indicates at this point. You spot anything wrong with these water mills? These are all AI generated. These water mills do not have water wheels in the water because the AI doesn't know how water wheels work. It just kind of made something that looked similar to the input photographs, the images that it had seen. Generative AI has no reality model, so it doesn't know when it's lying, just like some of you folks. Just like humans. Doesn't necessarily know when it's lying. So you have to compensate for that. All right, let's get to the one that's most likely to make people mad. Not many, but in a group this size, there will probably be a few. I love my process. Everybody should use it. Do some of you know folks that are emotionally attached to their process? The English word is they evangelize for it. They try to convince you from almost a religious perspective that you should be excited about it too. Look, processes are fine. Processes are needed. They help us manage the extraordinarily complex process of development. But I do not believe that any one process works for everybody because things vary too much. Teams vary and companies vary and problems vary. So you just can't have one that works for everybody. But there are people in the process space who do in fact claim that their process is the best and works for everybody. And I will show you one. This is the first page, off the first page, of the foundational work for Scrum. I don't usually read slides, but I will in this case. Industrial process control theory is a proven body of knowledge that describes why Scrum works and other approaches are difficult and finally untenable. Let me translate that from unnecessarily complex English. Scrum works and nothing else does. That is what that sentence is saying. I stopped reading the book when I saw that sentence because anybody who seriously believes that has nothing to tell me that I want to learn. So, and of course, Scrum's been out a long time now. People become more pragmatic about it. Some of you may use it. And if you use it and it helps you get software out, quality software, under controlled time frames, because pretty much all the agile methods have accountability built in and feedback built in, and those are essential to software development, no doubt about that. So if you're using it, I will never try to talk you out of a process that works for you. But don't then extend the idea that, man, because it works for me, it works for everybody. Don't think that way. You're lying to yourself if you do. And understand that other people have noticed this lie. This was put out a couple of years back. There's the link if you'd like to go read the detail. UK wasting $37 billion a year on failed agile IT projects. Here's one of the key quotes here. Half of CIOs regard agile as discredited. Half. 50% say they now think of agile as an IT fad. These are the decision makers. These are the people who are signing checks for agile. If you go to somebody like that and you evangelize agile to them, what are you doing to your career prospects? So be careful. Understand where things fit and where they don't. And I also have while I think agile is fine as a process pragmatically used, it's a code-centric process. It's primarily for managing the code production parts. But in my world, there are parts that come before that, understanding and design parts. And because of that, when we go in to work with these clients, especially on what we call high design projects, innovative projects, where we're striving for innovation. To do innovation, you must have big picture thinking. You must understand the big picture pretty well to realize whether something, to have the connection that an innovative solution will make a big difference. And Agile is very granular. It's like individual features off the backlog. Well, that's fine for getting things done, but it's not fine for innovation. It does not promote innovation. Now, I understand why. I'm not being overly critical. I'm just saying for you to be sensitive of it, because it's almost a necessity that Agile was created, and the other related methodologies were created, to cope with all this complexity, this crushing complexity that we have now. It gets worse every year. But inevitably, if you spend more time on that, you have less time to spend on big picture thinking. And there's always something to be done today, isn't there? There's always that bug to be fixed or that feature to get out. Well, your professional development will be better if you do set aside time to focus more on the big picture. Developers don't do that enough. It surprises me how some developers will go for ridiculous amounts of time, years, and never take a day or a half day to think about the big picture of what they're building and where the gaps are and where the innovations might be. So I suggest you do. Let me give you an example from an actual project I worked on. Yeah, this is kind of the last one. In 2010, I worked with 3M Company doing a radiology reporting app. You know, radiologist is looking at the MRI and telling you what he finds. And at that time, they all looked like type from a Selectric typewriter, because that's the way they started in the 80s. And so I asked the question, as we're going through this, thinking about this from a big picture perspective, well, right now the thing says in the upper left medial whatever, it describes where they're going to talk about. I said, why can't you just go grab a piece of the screen and drop it right into the report? And I was afraid they would say, well, for legal reasons you can't do that. But no. The people at 3M looked at me and went, there's about 8 of them in the room. And they all went, that would work. And that turned out to be the feature that drove them into like $400 million in sales in the first 5 years. Just by questioning the assumption of what does a radiology report need, what should it look like? See, if I'd just taken the requirement from the old system, I would have produced a radiology report that was just like that system. But instead, if you innovate, you try to expand your picture. Oh, yeah, we don't have time for this one, do we? Yeah, this is the last one, but I will skip that one and go on to the bottom. Since we're kind of out of time, it takes a little bit of time. Let's get down to our wrap-up. Yeah. The general theme, and the reason I talk about lies and don't lie to yourself and don't lie to other people, is that clarity is key to success in software development. And we don't have enough of it. So strive for clarity. Don't deceive your users or your management, or especially yourself. Treat that code addiction. Build more skills to apply to software development, and you'll produce more value. And learn to listen. So that's my kind of wrap up of some points. We probably could take one or maybe two questions, but I'm kind of right at the end, so I don't want to abuse my position. Anybody have any burning questions that this inspired? No, it's the end of a long day. You just want to get out of here, don't you? Yeah, I can tell. All right, thank you very much. I hope you have found some valuable information that you can take back with you. I had a great time talking to you.